Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're going to completely demystify a topic that literally trips up so many researchers, evaluators, and students. We are tackling exactly how to calculate sample size. But listen, we aren't going to just sit here and memorize blind, confusing formulas. Nobody wants that. Instead, we're taking a super practical, step-by-step journey that reveals the actual decision logic happening behind the numbers. Let's get right into it.
Picture this. You are put directly in the driver's seat of a brand new research project. Your program operates across a district, and you have exactly 50,000 beneficiaries. You need to conduct a survey to estimate how many of them are satisfied with your services. So, how many people do you actually need to interview? Do you really need to survey all 50,000? Definitely not. Is 50 enough? What about 500? I see people all the time just guessing a random percentage. They'll say, oh, let's just survey 10% of the population. But I can tell you right now, taking a blind percentage is absolutely not the answer. To find the real number, we actually have to build it from scratch using 3 core assumptions.
Okay, let's dive into this. Our very first baseline assumption is the confidence level. Basically, this describes the long-run performance of our confidence interval. Now, for most social and applied research surveys, the standard go-to value is 95% confidence. The absolutely crucial thing to understand here is that greater confidence demands a larger sample. If you suddenly decided, hey, I want 99% confidence, you're going to need to collect significantly more observations. But for our scenario today, we're going to stick with the classic 95%.
Next up, we have to decide on our margin of error, which is our precision. Let's assume we want a margin of error of plus or minus 5 percentage points. What does that mean? Well, if our survey finds that 60% of people are satisfied, the true value is highly likely to be somewhere between 55% and 65%. Now, tightening this precision requirement, say demanding a super tight plus or minus 2% margin of error, is going to dramatically inflate your required sample size. Why? Because the margin of error actually gets squared in the denominator of the standard formula. Basically, precision is really expensive, so plus or minus 5% is a very standard practical choice for our baseline.
Our third assumption involves the expected proportion. This is just what we anticipate the true answer to be. But wait a second, if we're doing a survey to find out the answer in the first place, what do we do when that prior prevalence is completely unknown? Well, we default to a conservative 50%. The math behind this is actually fascinating. Mathematically speaking, an even 50-50 split produces the largest, safest sample requirement in the standard formula. So, rule of thumb, when in doubt, just assume 50%.
And that brings us right here. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is that 385 is not some magical, universal number, even though you honestly see it everywhere in survey research. It is simply the direct mathematical result of the 3 textbook assumptions we literally just built: 95% confidence, plus or minus 5% precision, and an unknown expected proportion of 50%. But hey, our journey's far from over, because, well, we don't live in a textbook. Section 1. Real-world survey adjustments. We are officially leaving the textbook behind and moving into some real-world problem-solving.
Let's move to and see how this builds. We must now take our baseline number of 385 on a rigorous 3-step adjustment journey. We're going to look at the finite population correction, the design effect, and expected non-response. Each of these steps is going to bend and stretch our target number to make sure it can actually survive contact with the real world. Our very first stop is the finite population correction, or FPC. This rule basically asks, is our sample a large, meaningful fraction of our total population? If our total population was tiny, like say just 1,000 beneficiaries, applying this correction would actually shrink our required sample size from 385 down to about 278. But remember our scenario? Our population is a whopping 50,000. Because 50,000 is already so large relative to our sample, it barely makes a dent in the mathematical uncertainty.
Which means even after checking the actual population size, our anchor number remains physically unchanged here at exactly 385. This completely busts that super common myth that massive populations automatically require massive sample sizes. No way! Once a population hits a certain scale, adding more people to the total adds relatively little sampling uncertainty. So 385 survives step 1.
Step 2 is the design effect. And oh boy, this is where things usually change drastically. You see, our 385 number assumes we're doing simple random sampling. It assumes we can magically teleport around, picking perfectly independent individuals. But in real public health or development surveys, we use cluster sampling, We sample by district, then by village, then by household. The problem with this is that people clustered in the same village often share the same infrastructure, similar socioeconomic conditions, and social norms. So they yield a lot less independent information than a purely random unclustered sample would. Because of this loss of statistical efficiency, we literally have to apply a penalty.
Let's assume a pretty standard design effect of 1.5 for our clustered field survey. We take our base of 385, multiply it by 1.5, and boom, we see a massive jump to 578. We now need 578 completed interviews just to maintain that original plus or minus 5% precision we promised ourselves at the very beginning. Clustering matters, folks, and ignoring it is a totally critical mistake.
Finally, we reach step 3, expected non-response. Okay, so we know we need 578 completed interviews in our hands. But out there in the real world, you cannot simply target exactly 578 people and expect every single one of them to be home, willing to talk, and providing perfect data. That assumes a 100% response rate, which is a total fantasy. We absolutely must calculate a buffer. For our scenario, let's assume a very realistic 90% response rate.
To calculate this correctly, we don't just lazily add 10%. We divide our requirement of 578 by our 0.90 response rate, and that shows our final field target jumping up to 642. So the crucial point is that you actually have to approach 642 people in the field just to hopefully end up with your required 578 completed interviews. Do you see how these cumulative real-world decisions physically stretch our initial assumption?
And this brilliantly illustrates the real difference between theory and practice. We started with this sterile, textbook initial calculation of 385, but after holding it up to the rigorous reality of cluster sampling and non-response, our true operational target is 642. This is what an actual defensible sample size calculation looks like for a survey estimating a proportion.
Section 2, Estimation versus Impact. Get ready for a sharp mental pivot here. Everything we just talked about was purely descriptive. We've been focused on the question, what percentage of beneficiaries are satisfied? But what if our research question changes entirely? We're now leaving basic survey estimation and entering a totally different statistical paradigm. There is a massive dichotomy here. Survey estimation asks how many beneficiaries currently attend school, but an impact evaluation asks, did our specific intervention actually increase school attendance compared to a control group? That is structurally entirely different. It requires comparative research designs that rely on statistical power, not just precision.
Let's demystify statistical power for a second. Think of it simply as your study's sensitivity. If your baseline school attendance is 60% and you want to know if your program pushed it to 70%, well, that's a massive 10 percentage point difference. But what if you need to detect a tiny change from 60% up to just 62%? Detecting a tiny 2% change requires a far larger sample than detecting a massive 10% change. This is exactly why that famous 384 or 385 formula completely falls apart here. You absolutely cannot use a proportion formula to evaluate an impact intervention.
And here is a massive warning sign, whether you're doing estimation or impact. Even if you perfectly calculate your national sample, say, hitting that beautiful target of 642, that sample might be completely useless if your actual goal is to draw robust conclusions about just one specific province, or compare genders, or isolate data for persons with disabilities. The overall national sample calculation might be totally fine, while the subgroup samples are just entirely inadequate. Your sample size has to be driven by the lowest level at which you need reliable conclusions.
Section 3, the final design principle. Let's bring this all together with an overarching philosophy.
Because without the right philosophy, all this math is basically just noise. This quote captures the core AAYAN methodology perfectly. Read it carefully. Sample size is not just a number. It is the numerical expression of your research design. Every single input we discussed today, from that 95% confidence to the 1.5 design effect to the 90% non-response buffer, was a deliberate design choice. Your final sample size is only ever as defensible as the assumptions you built upon. A simple website calculator just can't do this thinking for you.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, provocative question. The next time you are tasked with finding a sample size, please stop reaching blindly for calculators and formulas. Put the math away for a second and ask yourself, what decisions must your evidence support? Who are you estimating this for? And at what reporting level? Once you define your research goals with crystal clarity, the correct sample size will naturally follow. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and happy researching.